And as the housing stock shrinks of available units, because that's the other thing. We've had a huge population increase, and then we have people like me, the baby boom, and we are the new homeless, some of us. I mean, some people have been homeless so long, they aged as a homeless person. But a large contributor to homelessness today are older people who are able to hang on, have a low level job, live in a trailer or a small house, or somewhat poverty, but then an illness comes along and everything's gone. They can't pay a medical bill, the car's repossessed, the house is gone. So there are a lot of older people, and that's a whole different order of service needs, because these are people sometimes with diabetes, advanced cardiac conditions. They've not been homeless before, so it's quite a shock to their aging systems to be in that situation or in shelters. So that's one of our more urgent needs, is the new homeless, as they're called, which are people. And keep in mind, these individuals, the life expectancies 10 to 20 years less. And as the housing stock shrinks of available units, because that's the other thing. We've had a huge population increase, and then we have people like me, the baby boom, and we are the new homeless, some of us. I mean, some people have been homeless so long, they aged as a homeless person. But a large contributor to homelessness today are older people who are able to hang on, have a low level job, live in a trailer or a small house, or somewhat poverty, but then an illness comes along and everything's gone. They can't pay a medical bill, the car's repossessed, the house is gone. So there are a lot of older people, and that's a whole different order of service needs, because these are people sometimes with diabetes, advanced cardiac conditions. They've not been homeless before, so it's quite a shock to their aging systems to be in that situation or in shelters. So that's one of our more urgent needs, is the new homeless, as they're called, which are people. And keep in mind, these individuals, the life expectancies 10 to 20 years less.
Deborah, talk to
Hello?
us a little bit about the history of homelessness.
That's a pretty long history to relate. I would say let me put it this way, other than the Great Depression, I don't think in the United States it was noticed or in any way kind of prominent, but certainly since the late 1980s, we have encountered what's been called the homelessness epidemic. And here we are in 2025, and it's probably the worst it's ever been in terms of numbers.
Yep.
So, the era that I've been involved in has started in the late 80s and continues today, about addressing homelessness, primarily in the United States, but also some other countries.
Right, right. So you speak about the homeless industry, and that was the first time I've heard that before. For people like me, what is that? What's going on with that?
Well, how do I describe? Well, New York City is the best place to illustrate it. I think it's a little less concentrated and obvious what's going on. But since the 1980s, both the state and city have put money forward for homeless, in addition to federal grants and so forth. And for around 1979, the right to shelter was decided by the state of New York Supreme Court, which means, mainly in New York, where most homeless people are, that everyone must be allowed a shelter bed or risk legal action. And
Oh, okay.
yeah, so there are law firms and groups of attorneys and organizations, including the Coalition for the Homeless, that are ready to do that. So the upshot of the right to shelter, I can't say that's only, but it certainly has spawned the growth of shelters, literally places where people can go and sleep. And when you think about how any kind of service becomes institutionalized and then money flows toward it, then you see how an industry grows up of, we have literally hundreds of nonprofit organizations in New York City, in addition to the city itself, which runs shelters. They also outsource through contracts with these hundreds of NGOs. And if you think about all that's needed to keep these places going, everything from van drivers to cooks, chefs for people where they provide food on site, messengers, just every kind of job you can think of related to running a shelter and running a program. So what you have, as I said, are many, many programs. Some of them own the buildings, many of them rent the buildings where they shelter people. And just the demands of this industry, as I call it, since it has taken on kind of an institutionalized, that is in perpetuity, keeping going, although right now as we speak the things could change dramatically. We won't go there yet, but that's pretty much it about an industry. Is there many types of jobs, many types of staffing needed to keep the industry going and provide places for homeless people to sleep at night. And some of them actually provide transitional housing and something more than just cots in a makeshift shelter.
That is a beautiful point. So basically, I just learned something. Wasn't even thinking about anything related to this, but the fact that that New York City created a law that said, "Hey, you guys need to provide. We need to provide shelter. It's our duty to provide shelter to people who are homeless," and that created a whole industry, an entire industry. I don't know. I never thought about something like that. But basically, because it's now a law, now you're going to have people trying to, create the housing and use some of those government contracts. And, they're going to outsource it to, the private sector and et cetera a lot too, because they can't do all of it. They don't have all the, you know what I mean? So there's a combo of the government helping with this and then private business, depending on these contracts and this law to make their money and also help homeless people as well.
Yes, I mean, the city of New York itself, as I said, runs the whole intake system, for example, to get access to a shelter. And they also directly operate shelters, but by and large, I don't have the number or percentage, but a vast number of the somewhat, say, 70,000 homeless people in the New York City area are in shelter of some kind. But that doesn't mean we don't have street homeless. So, we've got both types of individuals, and many of the street homeless individuals do not press for their right to shelter because they do not want to go into a shelter, or they have been and know what it's like. So the right to shelter is a mixed blessing, I will say.
What is it like, Deborah, to be in a shelter?
Well, I've not been in one, but I can tell you we've interviewed people on the street, people in transitional permanent supportive housing, all about this. And particularly the street folks tell us in no uncertain terms that the shelters are crowded, they're not safe, they're not sanitary, there's drugs often being sold under the table. Crowded meaning literally like 18 inches between cots. You don't usually have a place. You might have a small locker, but generally you don't have any place to put your things. So as you sleep, you have to, keep them close to you so they won't get stolen, shoes or whatever. And you have to leave in the morning. So literally the shelter gives you a place to sleep. Not such a great sleep with that many people in a large room area. So it's, as people told us, it was very unsafe, unsanitary, and they clearly found the sidewalks better
Mhm.
I guess if the temperatures go down dramatically, that shelter occupation does go up. But if given a preference, many people, thousands, choose not to use.
Wow. Wow, that sounds like prison almost. Worse than they're selling drugs under.
It has a carceral quality to it.
Yeah.
There are some that are a little bit more low threshold, and they are much better about that. They're smaller, people can come and go. But generally speaking, the shelter system is of fairly large shelters. Now, I'm not talking about families, by the way. I'm mainly talking about individual adults,
Mm.
families, but their shelters aren't much better. I'm just saying families, which are typically a mother and small children, are usually put in a place where at least meals, they can prepare meals. It may be congregate, they may be sharing a kitchen with several families. They may be in a motel where they have to, eat whatever is available to them. Other places have, I don't know what you call them, cafeterias, food service on the premises. It varies.
Nice. So there's obviously different types of shelters. Are there shelters where it's only for like women and children
Mhm.
type of situation? Okay.
Yes, the intake, this is partly mandated by HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development in Washington, D.C., that there should be some organized way to keep track of people and have a management system in which you know who is homeless and where they are and so forth. To make sure they did this, they have a single point of entry, it's called, for families. That's in the Bronx.
Oh, okay.
For men, that is a shelter at Bellevue Hospital, near Bellevue Hospital. And for women, it's in Brooklyn. I'm forgetting the name of the shelter, but the point is that people have different points of entry and they must go to those points they may stay in an emergency shelter, they may stay in the Bellevue Men's Shelter, which is a very unpleasant place, before they actually get their assignment. And the assignment may depend upon whether they have a physical disability, if they have a psychiatric disability, hopefully effort will be made to channel them towards the many nonprofits that run transitional housing, that is apartments and buildings and places where people with serious mental illness will live with a lot of services, supervision, and so forth.
Okay. Okay. So there's separation depending on multiple factors. That's
Yeah, I mean, we even have, I think, a few medical shelters. These are people with serious medical problems. But generally speaking, the medical problems are met with a visit to an emergency room in a hospital. And this leads me to note that people on the streets, or people who don't end up in shelters, and many who do end up in shelters, but at any rate, that it's very costly to do nothing and to leave it to the hospital emergency rooms or the jail system or the court system to deal with what is obviously a growing problem, a much more visible problem of people with no place to sleep or live.
yeah. So there's like so many things. So we're definitely gonna get into the mental health
Mhm.
aspect of this. I did want to ask you because right now, we're not gonna get too political, but I'm just curious because I've heard a lot of people talk about LA and California and the homeless problem going on there. And for years, people talk about kind of like a homeless problem going on in New York. Um, but I'm
Mhm.
wondering if these states just have more compassionate, I don't know if that's the right
Mhm.
word, but they have better policies in place that attract homeless people. And I just wanted, you're the
Mhm.
expert.
Ugh,
What's
you say,
yeah.
that's a frequently asked question, that people are drawn to New York because we have a higher level of public assistance or um, disability income, SSI, or so forth. The research does not show that people travel to places either because of the weather or the availability of benefits. Most surveys of homeless people have found that they are literally camping out or in a shelter just a few miles from where they grew up. So it's pretty much not people traveling around looking for good deals. And I just want to say that New York was one of the first places, possibly because of the numbers, but New York City was one of the first places to really take note of this growing problem and to dedicate funding to resolving it. New York City and state, they actually came together, hard to believe, and they're called New York agreements, which I'm not sure is still in effect, but for several waves of time, the city and the state pooled funds together to ensure that there was some transitional housing for people who are chronically homeless or have disabilities. California virtually did nothing for a long time because they corralled people into a 52 square block of downtown LA, which in the 80s was kind of an abandoned area. You know, LA was everywhere but the downtown area. So it's called Skid Row. And if you were homeless, you were pretty much left alone to sleep on the sidewalks or put a tent up or so forth. And then the services, on-site services in that Skid Row were largely run by faith-based organizations, charities, that didn't necessarily have easy access to housing. They weren't necessarily the organizations that could put them in line for rental vouchers or housing. They got better at it as time went on, but what we're seeing in New York is a delayed response in comparison. I'm sorry, in LA compared to New York. They have their problems for somewhat different reasons, but yeah.
Yeah. I guess I didn't realize that a lot of people were saying that people were running to the Social Security benefits and all that stuff. I just thought that in the South, it seems like there's a lot more, like you said, church-based helping the homeless out type of situations. And I don't know if funding is as strong, from the state when it comes to homelessness as it is like in LA and New York City, and how they have a system in New York, like how there's an industry. I'm curious, and I don't know, maybe if you would know if that's kind of in other states as well, because it does seem like, I don't know, a lot of people do end up homeless in some of these areas. It's more concentrated in some of these city areas, and I guess that was just a rumor. People were just saying that it seems like these states offer better, I guess, opportunities maybe for homeless folks than other places.
Well, this is where it gets interesting, because I think the book that many people are reading is called Homelessness is a Housing Problem by Greg Colburn, and I forget his first name is Ahern is the second author. But what they did is they actually looked at patterns of homelessness across the United States and did find, of course, the concentrations in California, New York. But if you think that poverty, which makes sense, is going to create homelessness, you would expect many homeless people in Detroit, for example.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Well, there aren't many people homeless in Detroit. So it's not just poverty, it's also the inequity of access to housing, affordable housing. And what Detroit has had, now I'm not saying as it grows more prosperous, it'll change, but was fair availability of low cost, low rent housing. So that helps explain a bit about the distribution of homelessness around the country and how some cities, or even the state of Mississippi, has relatively few homeless people. And that's mainly because, Mississippi has a lot of low access, not high rent, but not necessarily livable housing or housing you'd want. But at any rate, housing is available at some level. So poverty is not the main contributor. It certainly is necessary, but it's never sufficient.
I love that clarity.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. Okay, so what is the relationship between homelessness and mental health? I mean, in New York City, there's you see a lot of homeless people on the trains, and definitely there seems to be a lot of mental health issues going on with a lot of people in the population, at least in New York City. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think that's been a topic that I've been dealing with since I got involved in this area in the 80s, because, uh, you know, decade and a half prior to that occurred what's called deinstitutionalization, where they literally closed down psychiatric hospitals across the country, inpatient.
Do you know
Um,
why, Deborah?
sorry.
Do you know why they did that? Why they closed
Yeah,
it?
yeah. There were exposés, television exposés, showing the horrendous conditions in these institutions, many of them going back to the 19th century. In the old days, when a person with mental illness might have insulin shock therapy, I forget some of the others, ice water baths, of course, electroshock to the brain therapy. There were horrendous so-called treatments of these individuals, but they're basically imprisoned in these large institutional type buildings pretty far from the cities. You didn't find so many of those in urban areas, and they were staffed, heavily staffed. But when there were public exposés of how horrible these places were, there was at least an awareness that people with mental illness deserve better. They deserve something resembling treatment. So they began closing them. And of course, that saved a lot of money because these were very expensive enterprises. The idea was that as they closed, that money would be transitioned over to community-based mental health services so that a person could leave the hospital, hopefully find some place to live, but most importantly, have a support system in a local mental health clinic that could dispense medication, do checkups, and so forth. That's where we really fell short. One of the many areas where we've fallen short is that the money just was not forthcoming. The states kept the savings of closed psychiatric hospitals, but spent a fraction of that on improving community mental health. So therefore, you have people with serious mental illness going untreated, having psychotic episodes, appearing in public, and so forth. I want to say right away, though, that the mentally ill homeless person is far more likely to be victimized by a violent crime than to commit a violent crime. But the news media, of course, covers the latter because that creates, a sense of fear and distancing from these individuals. And it really is pretty rare, but it only takes one to capture the headlines.
Wow.
I'll
Yeah.
give you, I'll give you a figure, that we use often. About 30% of homeless people have a serious mental illness, such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. So that leaves 70%. And the vast majority of that 70% are women and children. And then the remainder, are people without serious mental illness, but have other disabilities or in some way or other misfortune hit them and they landed in the streets. And that's not predictable. We have many, many poor people, but only a percentage of them end up sleeping on sidewalks or in shelters. And we can't explain the difference, why some people end up homeless. It's like a nightmare game of musical chairs. If you know the game musical chairs, where people circle chairs, the music stops, and there's only enough chairs for 5 and 6 people. So it's kind of that person that lost out when the music stopped. They're no different from the other 5 people, except they had the misfortune to not get access. So that's kind of the way we view it, is there are individual characteristics, mental illness, drug use, whatever, that accompany sometimes people into homelessness, but the causes, there's a lot of drug users that aren't homeless, and a lot of mentally ill people are not homeless. how do we predict who's going to become homeless is not something that we have any formula or way to know.
Well, we were talking a little bit before, and you said, or I don't even know if you said it during this discussion, but you were saying that in 2025 now homelessness has been on the rise, and you did say that part of that is, well, you didn't say for right now, but part of what does predict homelessness is the ability to afford housing. And I was looking at some stats, and it seems like COVID and post, now we're now post COVID, that the homelessness rate increased more. There's more homeless people, and it's, I don't, there must be some connection to the fact that housing has gone up a lot in the past couple of years partly because of COVID, which is interesting. So we kind of do know, so we know a little bit. We know poverty doesn't play it's not a only role, but the affordability as well plays a huge role. And then, if a lot of women and children are the victims of being homeless, I don't know. That's interesting. There has to be something going on there with that.
Yeah, I'm not so sure homelessness went up in COVID per se, but the 18% increase, which is one of the largest increases found in the last PIT or point in time count, definitely points to really what is the disparities in our society. And the fact that if you look historically, the roots of this problem are in the Reagan administration and a philosophy that less government is better. And basically ending, they continued with the Section 8 or housing choice vouchers and certain, public assistance and so forth. But what decisions were made about housing were largely leave it up to the private sector. That was the mantra of the Reagan era. Don't let government do it, they'll ruin it. Well, the private sector was happy, these developers, to take this on, but they did not build housing for poor or low income people. So the squeeze was on starting in the 80s, and the squeeze continues, and it's getting worse because private developers are becoming much more open and flaunting that they have these $1 million condos. Sometimes the local government will say, but you got tax write-offs, so you need to provide a certain number of units to low-income people. But the enforcement of that, I don't know the latest on that, but it's not very prominent. How are you going to force a develop? Then you get the NIMBY response of people living in the building don't want to see 20 units. So it's a self-perpetuating cycle of more housing, but all high-income housing, and far less low-income housing, and no incentives from government, tax or otherwise, to change that. And so that also explains the shelter industry, because that is the parallel of what's going on in terms of housing, is these horrible crowded shelters versus, a boom in condo and co-op developments for people with money. So it's partly, or a large part of it, is the inequities in our society around income. And also, if you want to take it up now or later, but race plays a big role in this as well.
Yeah, let's take that up.
You want to do it?
Yeah.
Well, I have given this a lot of thought, written a little bit about it, but again, we have to go back to, now we're going to go back to after World War II, when there was a huge boom, not just a baby boom, that's another issue, but a boom in housing, large tracts of suburban houses, urban renewal, where we tore down low-income slum areas or so forth. And all through that period, it was basically Jim Crow at work, in the sense that African American, even GIs, even veterans couldn't get home loans for these Levitt towns, you know, these huge tracts, suburban tracts. There were covenants where the white residents of a particular area would ensure that no realtor would show homes to African American families, even if they were a doctor or lawyer, someone with, you know, a great deal of income, they still weren't welcome. So over time, African American people were crowded further into inner city areas. They just were not allowed to benefit from all of these programs. And that the result of that is that white people on average have 10 times the financial assets of African American families of the same size. And so that puts African American families much closer to that tipping point of homelessness. And it's the, you know, it was really a public private, I mean, realty boards, real estate developers, everyone accepted that we would discourage African Americans in any way possible. And owning a house is one of the few ways that an American can actually get asset growth, and, you know, trading it in for a nicer house or whatever. But that form of income in real estate is extremely valuable. And we see it, of course, in New York, even more so, since we're squeezed into islands.
Yeah.
That's the race part. I mean, it to me is not addressed often enough. The incredible disparities and the racism of the post-World War II period. It's as if after the Civil War, you know, everything
just.
Yeah, I mean, yes, we had the Jim Crow era, and of course we've had blatantly racist candidates for office, George Wallace and others. I mean, we know racism has been alive and well all this time, but it really comes to the surface now when we're in this stage where there aren't enough places to live. And so this is why you get disproportionate, you know, like 40% or so of the homeless are African American. There's no one single group other than African Americans that have the largest proportion, and 13% of the US population. So you can see the disparity right there in terms of how African Americans are in the US population and how they are one of the largest single groups among the homeless.
Deborah, that's why I have you on.
Oh, thank you.
That's exactly why I have you on.
I just start talking, but I'm happy to oblige.
Thank you, for bringing that up, because I think people we can sense, a lot of the listeners are going to be like casual listeners, kind of like me. There's going to be some casual listeners, like casual historian type people, where not historians. We know a little history, the stuff we can remember. But,
yeah.
But that's why I'm so happy to have researchers and historians and all of the people that look into this stuff on, because we miss a lot of technical details and stuff like that, and it feels good to know like someone like Deborah is on it.
I can't say I'm totally on it, but I'm one of the people.
One of the many
Who has dedicated a good chunk of my professional career in this area, and living in New York City, of course, where housing first began. And that's, another phase of my career. But living in New York City, it's hard to think of a problem more resistant to change. And yet billions are spent on it every year.
Deborah, you know what? I should have asked you this in the beginning. What got you into looking into this? Because, you mentioned just now that housing began in New York. So I don't know what piqued all of this for you anyways.
Well, that's kind of a hard question to answer. I mean, I have a degree in anthropology, and I did my research in the city of Milwaukee I won't say how many years ago, but it was around ethnic groups and acculturation and some of those issues. But I really kind of found a new direction in my career when I got a postdoctoral fellowship at Columbia School of Public Health to get an MPH, a master's in public health, but also to start a career. And at New York State Psychiatric Institute, which is up at Columbia University, you know, in Washington Heights, two really important centers of research were going on. One was AIDS. When I was there in the mid to late 80s, some of the real groundbreaking work in AIDS was being done there, other places as well. And the other was homelessness. And New York City had, you know, disproportionately these issues much more present. And I can't say in particular why. I worked with some people I really admired. But I will say that it really did put me on a multi-decade course of doing research, because I got involved with Housing First after it started in 1992. And I knew the person, Sam Simbaris, who founded it, as a friend, and just became interested in it because I was just incredulous that you could offer an apartment to someone with drug and mental problems and all that without any conditions other than visits from service providers and a portion of any income to the rent. So I will say it was kind of opportunistic on my part that I did see Housing First in action and thought this is something pretty special. I want to follow this. You know, I want to provide the anthropological or the qualitative, not statistics, not epidemiology and so forth, of the human side of it. And certainly I'm not the only one that was interested or did this. But I was one of the few that had access to Pathways to Housing, which is where it all started. And I think that's how I was able to get grants from the National Institute of Mental Health, because primarily it was people with a mental illness who were housed by Pathways to Housing. It was not a model for families or other types of disabilities. It was for psychiatric survivors who are also homeless and who also often were using drugs. So it's a little bit opportunistic, a little bit, you know, wanting to be of service in some way. But it's served me well, so I'm pretty satisfied with it. I'm not gonna, at my age, I'm not gonna take up anything very new, but I'm happy to stay in this place, in this space of housing.
No, and we're happy you did it, Deborah. It's good to look at people and sometimes not just the numbers. The numbers for the nerdy people out there, kind of like me, it takes you a while to realize like statistics, they don't tell the entire story. They don't tell even most of the story. You know, it could be 50%, generally speaking, 50% of the population is this. That doesn't apply to many people, and a lot of people literally do forget that, because, you know, it's just convenient, you know, like half of the population or most of the population for women are this height, but then you meet so many people who are, you know, a different height, and you forget that that applies in every way, in every part of life, the same, you know, like that. There's a deeper story behind the numbers, and it doesn't, you know, apply the way we do apply it. I don't know. I'm talking in a circular, so I might take this out. But I'm just saying that yeah, very happy that you decided to dig a little deeper and try to find out what's really going on outside of the numbers. So there's a lot of myths about homeless people, and you know, yeah, there's many myths. So we're going to talk about a few of them. Okay. And the first one that I'm sure is a very popular myth amongst a lot of people is, are homeless people spending money on drugs?
Do non-homeless people spend money on drugs? I'm curious.
Well, Deborah, I plead the fifth. I can't
Is
really.
this something that only homeless people do? Of course, some homeless people spend money on drugs. I mean, it's nothing new at all. I mean, I think you need to distinguish between the very conservative movement that is present in this country right now that says basically people are homeless because they are drunk or use drugs. And the backlash to Housing First has been just that these people aren't homeless for any other reason except their own personal failings and bad decisions and so forth. So yes, homeless people do use drugs. As far as addiction being a cause of homelessness, I'm sure it is for some, but it's still not the majority of homeless people because, as I said, the majority are women and children, and drugs are not the issue there. It's just sheer outright poverty. So yes, you see that happening, but I will just counter by saying that we've tried in the drug world and alcohol world to do rehab, and it doesn't work that well, 12-step or otherwise. Some people are helped, but there's no guarantees. So there are attempts to deal with that, but the fact of the matter is, if you're out sleeping outside and you're worried about your safety or being assaulted or whatever, you might find it tempting to find some way to dull the pain, shall we say. So I think some use drugs partly because they're available and because they help in coping. But addiction is a cause of homelessness. I wouldn't rank it up near the top, really. It's really about poverty. Too many housed people use drugs.
Okay, before we finish the myths, you did mention that a lot of people get assaulted that live on you're more likely to be assaulted if you're homeless.
Mhm.
And are there a lot of women and children that are living on the streets that get assaulted?
No, I mean, I think it happens sometimes. Well, let me back up. Now that we have thousands of migrants or asylum seekers in the city, this is a relatively brand new thing. But I'm saying there you might see a family with children on Randall's Island or in a tent or somewhere. But that's fairly recent, and that's another issue, really. You don't see most homeless families or even most homeless people on the street because New York City does have a right to shelter. So I don't think, if you think about it, we in our society, to see a 3 or 4-year-old or even a 10-year-old sleeping on a sidewalk, it just isn't done.
Yeah.
I've done research in India where it is done and where it's very common to see 2 or even 3 generations of families sleeping literally on a sidewalk with a few blankets. In our society, we don't usually see children visibly homeless. They're homeless, but they're not visible. They're in some kind of temporary housing. So that is just the way, the way that we've set up the system is to give families top priority, not top priority necessarily to get housing. Like I've said, the key for families is to get rental vouchers or get some, maybe even what they call rapid rehousing, which is one influx of cash to help pay back rent or pay a medical bill. They are not the chronic homeless people, families. The chronic are more likely to be single men and women with mental or other physical problems, and they just can't find the income, which has to be phenomenal amount these days, to get a landlord to accept them. And even with a voucher, a housing choice voucher, which is a pretty good deal. I mean, it pays most of the rent, and if you have some income, it'll take a small percent of that. But landlords won't accept it, and it's against the law to do that, to deny someone an available apartment based on they have housing vouchers or they're receiving public assistance. They do it anyway because enforcement is really hard to carry off. So families, they're hidden. I'm not saying they're in great places, but they're by and large hidden. So who's not hidden are the men and women, sometimes together, sometimes different configurations, but they are sleeping outdoors.
Gotcha. And I don't know if you know this, Deborah, but well, for the chronic homeless person, is it mostly men then? I would think probably.
It is predominantly male,
Okay.
but there's still, I don't know the percent, but I would guess it's probably 70% or so. That's my just rough guess because I haven't checked on this. But again, as with the influx of migrants, it's changed quite a
The
bit,
numbers. Okay.
and the characteristics of them.
Do homeless people tend to have jobs?
They can, and they do. I'm involved with a research study in Los Angeles called an unconditional cash transfer. This is the big thing now, is to provide cash, cut out the middleman, just straight on. And in this study, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting your question. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
no. Do they
Yeah, I
have
got so
jobs?
caught off on this vision of these people.
No,
No,
do they have jobs?
jobs. Yes, sorry, jobs. Yeah. Many do. What we found out in LA is many do. You have to almost have to have a car or at least a bicycle or something to get to a job because LA's so spread out. But I was impressed by the number of people we interviewed in this unconditional cash transfer study who would go work, food service. One guy was a DoorDash. He worked at DoorDash and he had a bicycle. And then he was able to get a motorized bicycle and even do that. So it's not unheard of to have jobs, but it's very difficult if you have no place to get cleaned up, to take a shower or to get ready, to have nice clothes, at least decent clothes to wear. So it's a struggle to have a job, but many do. And I honestly couldn't tell you the percent because I think when you are a person with a serious mental illness, it's that much harder, or a drug or alcohol problem. It makes it incredibly more difficult to get a job because you don't have credentials, you don't have experience. I mean, a person with mental illness, a serious one, probably got sick in their late teens, early 20s. And those are pivotal years for gaining education, job skills, and so forth. So if you're spending those years in and out of hospitals, unable to really sustain employment, it puts you at a huge disadvantage. But for those who are relatively healthy and young and capable, I was impressed by how many, might sleep in their car and find some way to go to the local Y or pay a small amount to a gym.
Yep.
So they could have a place to get cleaned up and go to work. Never enough work or salary to pay for an apartment in Los Angeles.
I've seen it.
You need a deposit, you need first and last month's rent, and it's $4,000 a month, or
Yep.
maybe $2,000 if you're, going to be in a lower income area. I mean, it's a lot of money you have to have if you don't have a housing voucher.
And it makes sense. First, I've seen people at the gym. I've seen guys mostly at the gym who I can tell,
Really?
we're there to clean up and go back in their car because the car is there like a lot and they come in and out. So I've seen that a lot. But yeah, it makes sense as to why New York City, LA, why they have stricter laws, it seems like, around housing, that they don't have as much down south. But because if homelessness is linked to the ability to afford a home, then I could see why they've been battling with that for a very long time.
Yeah.
Are there any other myths that you think people have surrounding homelessness that you want to mention?
I think I dispelled the one, which is they come from somewhere else to take advantage of, of our welfare system or whatever. people, some of the drug use you see on the streets or panhandling, they're not homeless people. They may be hanging out, so we label people as homeless if they're just outdoors doing things.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the percents are, but a fair number of poor people panhandle and at night go home to a, not much of an apartment in the Bronx or somewhere. So there is that sense that all panhandlers are homeless or whatever. I hope I have dispelled the myth that all homeless people use drugs and alcohol, because the percentages are usually a minority. Now, it depends on areas, like parts of San Francisco. Yes, there's a lot of needles. There's a lot of, some of the newer drugs, opioids. But overall, if you look at the national picture, it's not so much, it's drugs, but not that they are an overwhelming part of these individuals' lives. And again, I will come back and say, housed people use drugs, some for years or decades. So what distinguishes them from the homeless person using drugs is they have a place to live. Yes, they may have had more opportunities in life, especially if they're white.
Right.
But it's not a simple kind of thing. And one of the other myths is the criminals. Homeless people are criminals, more likely to hurt somebody, which is simply not the case. I think all of these myths about the homeless serve the desire to blame them for their problems, to blame the victim. And it couldn't be further. I mean, when you think about it on a little bit more of a larger scale way, it's really about a society where we as a society and our governments will not make efforts to build and maintain social housing, what they do in Europe. And as the housing stock shrinks of available units, because that's the other thing, we've had a huge population increase, and then we have people like me, the baby boom, and we are the new homeless, some of us. I mean, some people have been homeless so long, they aged as a homeless person. But a large contributor to homelessness today are older people who are able to hang on, have a low level job, live in a trailer or a small house, or somewhat poverty, but then an illness comes along and everything's gone. They can't pay a medical bill, the car's repossessed, the house is gone. So there are a lot of older people, and that's a whole different order of service needs, because these are people sometimes with diabetes, advanced cardiac conditions. They've not been homeless before, so it's quite a shock to their aging systems to be in that situation or in shelters. So that's one of our more urgent needs, is the new homeless, as they're called, which are people. And keep in mind, these individuals, the life expectancies 10 to 20 years less. So people we interviewed, if they were 50, we considered them to be almost elderly, given all the problems, the physical health problems, just the signs of living on the street, skin problems, skin diseases, infectious disease. You'll see people have lost an arm or a leg to gangrene because it was untreated infections that become literally a source of what do they call it? I mean, just loss of limb, loss of activity or mobility ability. So there's that. And I think the myth generally is the overall myth that is the hardest to get rid of, and which is really taking over in these conservative institutes, which fund all sorts of reports on homelessness, is simply that the homeless person is responsible for their homelessness. Therefore, they have to be responsible for getting out of homelessness. And if they are on drugs, they will need to go into mandatory treatment. If they're mentally ill, they must also take their medications, and the medications are really hard on them. I mean, it causes weight gain, diabetes. It's not necessarily a situation of improving their lives by having them take psychoactive medications.
Yeah,
They come with a cost.
I was yeah, they do come with a cost. Definitely weight gain is one which could lead to diabetes. There's I looked at a stat a while back that said that mostly a lot of elderly people are in poverty. And it's very interesting because what's going on with government and Medicaid and possibly Social Security is not a little, it's insane. That's going to be a massive, if that ever does, happen, that's going to be crazy. But
Yeah.
you speak about kind of like this hostility towards homeless people. Um, and what do you think? What do you think of like the policing of homelessness? I've heard you talk about this in another
Yeah.
interview. And also, where do you think the hostility comes from? It's funny because I don't want to blame. I don't know. I feel like I used to be so much more compassionate, and I had a few bad encounters like in New York, um
Mm-hmm.
with a few homeless people. And I don't know, even me, I kind of have to check myself, because I think there's a few myths that I had, which was, they're probably gonna if I they're gonna spend it on drugs, is was a huge myth. Well, they didn't start because of drugs. They didn't become homeless because of drugs. But yeah, where do you think the hostility comes from? And uh what do you think about the policing of
Yeah.
homelessness?
That's that's a really important topic. I think the hostility, what we call NIMBY, not in my backyard, that's where the hostility really causes serious system-wide problems, because there's no place to go, even if you have the funds to provide housing. And most of the western part of the United States is zoned for single family dwellings. So until they change zoning, I mean, we live in New York City. That's laughable. Single family, on a plot of land. We're stacked up to 100 stories, but out in California and many parts of the West, and I believe personally, I think that's kind of part of racism too, is the single family, and then allowing neighborhoods to kind of dictate or protest what kind of shelter could be put there. The police are a representation of that social stigmatizing and ascribing all these horrible characteristics to homeless people. But if you sit down and you talk with them, they're not that different. Being homeless for years does make you more depressed, more anxious, and that kind of thing. The policing is where I think we're reaching a real crisis point, because this is around the encampments. Generally, at least in New York City, the police will leave you alone if you're just panhandling. You can't beg aggressively. That's an ordinance. But if you just have a cup out and a sign, you're fine. So the police don't bother you. Where the police come into play is in like Grand Central Station or Penn Station, or places where a lot of public is coming and going, and they try to keep the homeless out of sight as much as possible, so that it won't show. But where the real criminalization issue is around these encampments, where they will issue a citation for public urination or littering or trespassing or whatever, and then you have a ticket, a citation, and a letter comes along, but there's no address, so it goes to the wrong place, requiring a court appearance. You don't make the court appearance, there is another fine given to the individual, as well as often a desk warrant or something saying they can go to jail. And many of them do indeed spend a night or two in jail for these small civil kind of infractions. So the criminalization is not for violent crimes or, felonies, or it's the accumulation of tickets and fines unpaid and the inability to get out from under that. And we interviewed people in LA who kept track of their credit record. And they were trying to think of ways to get their credit better because the landlords or the future employers are not going to be happy with them. And it's very difficult. So the criminalization is literally putting people in jail for infractions that the rest of us behind closed doors take for granted. It's just an accumulation of all those small things happening. There's not many major crimes. It's really about enforcing relatively minor infractions.
Right.
That then blow up into multi-$100 fines.
Very happy. Yeah, glad you we brought that up because that's a huge.
It is.
Yeah.
It truly is, and it's hard to get out from under that. Finding a job is hard enough, but having debt, it follows you. You can't, it's a constant drag on your ability to recover your life and, live indoors and be with your family and so forth.
These are all just practical things. I don't know, like things that can happen to anybody. You can get cancer or whatever and some medical issue and who knows fully why. And you end up homeless and or like holding on and something happens and you end up in a situation like this and it just kind of feeds into the next situation, into the next situation, into the next situation.
Right.
Have you
Go ahead, sorry. No, I was just going to say, we used to have, I think we even have a few movies about this, about people who were pretty wealthy and then they just kept going downhill, either the drug use or mental illness or other things. And they were discovered, on a street corner panhandling, and they were recognized. Hey, aren't you the person that was, a famous football player or something? That happens, but by and large, the people who are homeless are people who have had lifetimes of difficulty and adversity. And what tipped the balance for them, as I said, could be a number of things, health problems being one of them, or just running up debt. But if we had housing, a lot of these people would be indoors. If we had affordable housing.
Yeah, and I think health insurance played a role in some of this. I just can't remember some of the numbers. Have you looked into homelessness and its impact in the healthcare system or vice versa, how the health?
You can't ignore that. And actually in the last few years, some of the most vocal defenders of the homeless people and crying out about their needs are doctors and emergency room staff, social workers too, just pointing out that being homeless puts you at risk of many illnesses, living outdoors, and of course, if alcohol can cause liver damage and etc. like that, but there are also a lot more traffic accidents, broken limbs or things because they're sleeping near the road.
Yeah.
As I said, being outdoors, I'm no doctor, but I know that staph infections of the skin cannot, it doesn't take long to become gangrene. And then, I saw in a documentary a woman who lost almost her whole arm to an infection. Had she been indoors, could have been easily dealt with. But the conditions of living outdoors are very extreme on people's bodies. And that's something until we provide a better form of shelter. I mean, low threshold is what we talk about. The high threshold is zero tolerance for drugs, for alcohol, for you have to follow many, many rules. Low threshold, safe havens are sometimes called, are much more humane. They're smaller. They're a little more flexible about if you're using drugs or alcohol, you shouldn't use them in the facility, but if you come in having used, you're not kicked out. And actually, the homeless people on the sidewalks we've interviewed here said they like safe havens. There just aren't enough of them. They're just, the city knows they're popular and that they do get people more stabilized. They're not housing, they have to share it with a roommate, and there are some requirements, but generally compared to the big shelters, they're much more attractive. And then you have the whole tiny homes, sorry, I could go in all sorts of
No,
directions.
that's good. Yeah.
I'll stop. But the tiny homes thing, it's really big out west, not so much here. They're usually built in land far away from a business district or an area where you could get a job. And if you have back problems or, arthritis or different things, you can't walk sometimes, or even, find your way to get to a bus stop. So the tiny homes, it's a big thing now. I think it's at best a mixed blessing. I mean, yes, people can come in out of the elements, but it's not really a life. It's not near, they're almost never situated near places where people could find, low wage, but jobs. Much less go to their doctor's appointments and places they need to go. So they're small steps, interim steps, but at the end of the day, we have so much property being bought up by LLCs, limited liability corporations, many of them overseas money. These are unknown individuals investing, and they've been doing it for a while, but it's really gone into much, much worse situation of finding buildings, buying buildings, letting them sit there if they want to, or letting them just rot, because these are multi-billion-dollar companies and they want the land that the building's on. They don't care, So people are left without a place to live because some LLC has bought the building and are literally making their lives miserable, so they'll go away. And this is happening all over the country. I know some people think that's exaggerated, but BlackRock or some of those other places, they've come out and said, well, we don't buy up single family dwellings. No, of course not. They buy in cities where the land is so valuable, but the buildings on not so much. So this is even creating a much greater emergency, in my opinion, situation of removing possible housing from access.
Yeah. And you know what? You did say that a lot of housing is for like single families. Why is that problematic? Is it because you can't build out a bigger
Right.
Yeah, okay. That's what I was
in LA they talked about what they call the mother-in-law cottages, where you could get a permit to put a small unit in your backyard. They thought that might be a way to, it didn't go very far. Part of it is the neighborhoods wouldn't stand for it, neighborhood associations or whatever. Here everything's stacked up. I mean, there are a lot of buildings now in the Bronx, particularly in parts of Brooklyn, that are barely habitable with electric wiring and heat availability. So unless the government gets more involved in housing, which is what European governments do, we're only going to see it get worse. I mean, there's almost no incentives to do anything but build shelters.
You know what? I heard a guy from the UK talking, and he said he was saying something like, in the UK, there's not as much of a homeless issue, and that's probably why, because they have housing for them in Europe. Do you know how much healthcare plays into it in terms of like people just not being able to afford a medical bill. I don't know if you vaguely remember any stats with that. Like you got sick and you couldn't afford a bill, and that made you were holding
Well,
on. And
that's the baby boomers. So it happens, of course, to all generations as their health deteriorates, but that's a big issue. I want to just say one thing about Britain. They do have a problem with homelessness
how do
because
they?
even though they have social housing, they haven't, they've had their own Ronald Reagan type, Margaret Thatcher, for example, leadership that has not, invested in that. The places where you see them, Finland, for example, Finland, they're the big success in my world. They've solved homelessness. Well, they've always had a tradition. It's also a very small country. And with the climate being such as it is, you have to almost provide something. But the persistence of that belief that some places are better off or whatever. I mean, I think here you just see, as I said, an aging population, and then you have young people. We haven't even discussed them, but I'll just say quickly that these are unaccompanied people, young people under age 18 are right around that time, and they're in foster care, let's say, and they turn 18 and they become homeless by virtue of aging out of foster care. So they're at least healthier as a rule, but health care, if you look at emergency rooms, particularly in the winter, you'll see a lot of people in there that don't have life-threatening emergency problems.
Yeah.
If you go to a library in the cold weather, you will see people in there that are passing the time, because libraries are one of the only welcoming places left in the public sector. And they're grappling with this themselves, overdoses or people taking up space, sleeping or whatever.
Well, I think you kind of you hinted at the answer to this next question. How do we solve it, Deborah? Finland.
Mm.
We look at Finland.
No, you don't look at Finland. They would like for us to look at Finland, but I feel strongly that Finland has taken too many victory laps, in my opinion. But how do you solve it? It's not complicated. You take all the billions. New York City is okay. That is complicated, but you take. I mean, New York City's spending way over $3 billion a year. That's how much HUD's whole budget is, and divert it into building housing, building units, multi-family, multi-unit buildings, or taking older ones and rehabbing. Yes, it's going to cost money, but I don't see how it can cost more than we're already spending. Because, the estimate is like a shelter bed runs around $3,000 a month for just maintenance, per person. So take the money and invest it. But there, as I've hinted at pretty broadly, there are vested interests that don't want that to happen.
I was going to say, lobbyists. Nope.
The lobbyists, the developers, the politicians who are, don't care. They know homeless people can't vote most of the time for one, just as a small matter. So, as every political race you see for mayor or for whatever, you see this come up, and yet it's just assumed that nothing's going to happen, that we're just going to build more shelters and not take that money and invest it. I think California's trying to do more of that, but even there, it's really hard to turn back the clock and start all over and really try to build housing that's affordable.
Well, Deborah, that's why I'm super grateful that we have the internet, and the normal person, the normie, can understand a little bit better what's going on, because I think it's so easy as a politician. I mean, everyone wants homelessness fixed. This is one of the things that majority of Americans are like, please, can we do something? And you just hear people, you hear a lot of lip service, but you don't understand why things are not changing. And once you follow the money and the policies and all that stuff, then you kind of get a deeper understanding of, okay, that's what's going on. That's why. And so it makes you look out and listen for different things, talk about things differently, which is the start of a whole new world of Finland, Deborah.
That's enough. We don't need to talk about Finland. I mean, all of Europe is, every country there is doing housing first. But they have a system of social values and social norms that are against homelessness, about helping people.
Do you think the stigma for homelessness has gotten better or worse from the beginning of your career to now?
Well, it's always been there, but I think it's getting worse because there are more and more visible homeless people, particularly in California. I will say, since New York does have a right to shelter and people do generally use the shelters, they don't often stay there very long. But out west, there's so few shelters even that you have encampments. And encampments are another whole order of problem, because what they do is they go in, the police, and they come with the sanitation trucks and they just take everything and throw it in the garbage. And I've seen this done in Washington, D.C., as a matter of fact. But the encampments are often the only place homeless people can come together and feel a little bit safe in numbers, sharing things. But they're eyesores to most people.
Yeah.
Outside. And, some cities or towns or counties try to offer services to those people, but housing for some reason is the last
Service.
goal, and it's the ultimate service. If you give them housing first, a lot of those other services will be far less a cause of problems, and that's the premise of housing first.
Housing first, get them close to have them close to jobs, close to other stuff. And yeah, if they get a job, it's hard to maintain that job. I think it's easy for people to understand it that way. If you're homeless, outside of people who have mental health issues and disabilities and stuff like that, but if you're homeless and you're going to work, you're looking kind of crazy, you're smelling, you know what I mean? I mean, it's just kind of common sense. So yeah. Well, Deborah, thank you. Where can people find you?
I'm a professor at New York University in the Silver School of Social Work.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Deborah.
Thank you, Mia. Good luck with your program.